You should be able now.
The seminar is open, Matthias.
Yeah, just open.
Okay, here I am.
Attendees are joining.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes.
Sam, I don't know if you...
En unos minutos comenzamos el seminario. El seminario va a ser en inglés, por lo cual voy a dar la introducción también en inglés. Voy a esperar unos minutos que termine de entrar el público y empezamos. Gracias por la paciencia. I just talking with the people that the seminary will be in English and that the introduction always would be also in English. I guess we are done. Okay, Alex, we can begin, yes? Okay.
Yes, for sure.
Let me just introduce once again this seminary. This is the Lord Acton Seminary. It's a joint initiative between Acton Institute USA and UCEMA. We begin with this almost a year ago, a little more than a year ago, under the coordination of Alex Chafuen, who is the managing director of International Acton USA. This space seeks to promote the debate of ideas, humanistic training, and the idea of an open society, of course. The Lord Acton Chair is coordinated by Acton USA, who suggests the speakers with the support of Instituto Acton Argentina. Today, we have the pleasure to have Peter Böttke and Sam Greg, but thank you both of you to be here. And I let Alex to introduce our speakers. And okay, the seminar is yours, Alex, and thank you as always to be here and to help us to have this moment, so interesting moment. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Edgardo, and what a great pleasure. I imagine most of you know Acton. You know, we work for a free and virtuous society, prosperous society, and we are grounded on liberty and responsibility. But we try to be guided by a Judeo-Christian anthropology view of the human person, and by the best social science. And for us, it's a great pleasure to be able to team up with UCEMA. It's a university that is well known in Argentina for rigorous standards and its approach to economics. I'm very respectful. They recently started the Hayek Friedman Center to show their openness to also to Austrian economics. And we picked topics, you know, that many of us are always students, you know, and today we have two of the best teachers that I admire most in the world, you know, Pete Böttke and Sam Gregg. As I'm a colleague of Sam Gregg at the Acton Institute, I thought of starting with Peter Böttke, who again, despite that he represents Austrian economics because we both studied under a disciple of Ludwig von Mises, Pete, through many decades of teaching and writing, incorporates into his analysis, you know, the contributions of different schools of thought. So again, it's an outstanding educator. I'm amazed, you know, how can he keep his production, you know, at such high level of consistency and quality. So Pete, thank you for joining with us at this Lord Acton Chair at the University of Macroeconomic Studies in Argentina. Pete, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that very warm introduction. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't thank the fact that I had Dr. Senholz as my teacher, and that he introduced me to these ideas. And you know, I'm very pleased to share this stage with Sam Gregg, who is an amazing scholar of the Ordoliberal tradition, and in particular of Wilhelm Robke. And Wilhelm Robke is actually, I first heard of him from Dr. Senholz, who constantly talked about him, as well as Mises and other, you know, thinkers. So what I'm going to try to do here, and I don't want to eat up all of our time, so I'm going to run through these slides rather quickly. But what I would like to do is I'd like to talk about Hayek and Buchanan and Elinor Ostrom, and their relationship to ordoliberalism. So the ordoliberalism that I'm talking about is the economic ideas that are associated with not only Robke, but also Walter Eucken, and what became known as the Freiburg School. I think in order to set the context here, it's important to remember that in the 1930s, economics and political economy went through a transformation. And what used to be the standard practice of economists, which is to recognize the institutional framework within which economic life took place. That institutions, the goal of economic theory in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s became one of having an institutionally antiseptic theory. And that required, in the United States in particular, a subculture movement that challenged that institutional antisepticness. And it's one of the reasons why Buchanan always said that the ordoliberals appreciated what he was up to before the neoclassicals in the United States knew what he was up to, because they never had the institutionally antiseptic notion. What do I mean by institutions here, as I'll try to elaborate, is the political, legal, and social infrastructure within which economic life takes place. And I want to, make sure I leave a lot of time for Sam to talk about this, but this political, legal, and social aspects of it take the form not only of the formal legal rules, the formal political structures, but also the social and cultural mores that provide in a society. And so therefore the sanctions that may come down to enforce the rules of the game are not only the police and the courts, but also our moral sanctions, shaming, shunning, other kinds of things that are related to the social context. And the whole point of the institutionally antiseptic notion was that we could somehow get rid of all of that stuff and treat the economy as basically a machine that these experts could, manipulate. And that became the thing that law and economics cut against, property rights economics cut against, market process economics cut against, and of course, public choice economics cut against. And so I want to tell that story a little bit. Sorry for that introduction. And I want to begin with Hayek, because in many ways, people think that when Hayek made his move to writing The Road to Serfdom or The Constitution of Liberty in the 40s and then carrying through the 40s, 50s, and 60s was because he lost two debates, a debate to the market socialists and a debate to the Keynesian macroeconomists. And therefore, they tell a story of Hayek being leading economics. But economics, the way Hayek understood it, the way that Menger understood it, the way that, the British classical economist John Stuart Mill understood it, economics was embedded within a broader discipline of political economy and moral philosophy. And what Hayek was doing was, in fact, trying to regain the institutions that aggregate economics and formalistic economics had squeezed out of economics, which made it seem that the Keynesians and the market socialists had defeated him. But the problem is that they didn't analyze the institutional context within which economic life takes place. So as a result, he has to write The Road to Serfdom, and then he has to write The Constitution of Liberty, and eventually Law, Legislation, and Liberty. All three of these books, I would argue, should be viewed as part and parcel of an ordoliberalism, right? Just like Jim Buchanan's work. And I want to, since I'm talking to people that are at the Hayek Friedman Center, I think it's kind of important to make a distinction between the way Friedman and Hayek and Buchanan pursued their career, recognizing, by the way, the tremendous contribution that Milton Friedman made. But Friedman was in many ways a very technical economist who did the kind of broader policy and social philosophy more as a hobby than as his research program. His research program was really the consumption function or the development of the equation of exchange and monetarism. But to Hayek and to Buchanan, their research program was political economy. It was the economic life being played out in the institutions, and their analytical analysis was on institutions. And that's different than Friedman. right? And so I think keep that in mind as you work, think about these ideas. So Friedman might not be an order liberal, but Buchanan and Hayek and Elinor Ostrom are. If you think about it this way, that's one of the ways. So one of these substantive propositions that Hayek sort of lays out in these books is that the first thing is he tries to explain how markets work. Markets work through the logic of choice and the role of the economic calculation. He wants to show that the logic of choice is a necessary but not sufficient component. This is Economics and Knowledge, his famous paper in 1937, and where he argues that you have to move from the logic of choice to situational logic. And when you move to the situational logic, you have to analyze the institutions within which the logic of choice is played out, and that the various different institutional environments will impinge or enable the playing out of economic calculation. And so this is how markets work. Markets work because they have property, prices, profits, and losses. Markets don't just work because they have individuals that are pursuing their self-interest. Individuals pursue their self-interest in a variety of different environments, as Adam Smith stressed, all right, to us. But you can have different consequences of that in terms of the playing out of that. So one of the consequences of the failure to engage in economic calculation is that you get a socialist metamorphosis, which is that rather than the system being able to generate a rationality in the economic system, it ends up by becoming dominated by political logic rather than economic logic. And that's why you get the idea of why the worst get on top, which is, first, we're trying to make all decisions political decisions, but we can't agree on specifics. According to Hayek, we can only agree on the general rules by which we interact with each other. But in order for socialism to actually be acted upon, we have to agree on specifics, which are beyond our ability to get agreement on, because we live in a pluralistic society. So instead, what we're going to have is a move away from the general rules and the imposition of those who are in power, which is why we get the logic of why the worst get on top. And so this is why The Road to Serfdom is a tragic tale. It's a tragic tale. It's not ironic that he dedicates it to socialists of all parties. He's writing to his friends in England who believed that they had to be socialists in their economics to maintain their liberalism in their politics. And he's trying to tell them socialism and democracy don't mix. They end up by falling apart. And he wants to put the focus then on the institutional infrastructure within which economic activities take place. So in Hayek's analysis of this, it wasn't viewed as the first runner in public choice as it should have, which is the economic application, the application of economic tools to the study of political decision making. And I want to ask the question, why? And the reason is because the essential positions of public choice was to just simply take economic theory and to analyze political decision making. It also stressed this behavioral symmetry, and which is that self-interest, and the idea that it's self-interest in markets, self-interest in politics, and so therefore we have to examine the logic of self-interest played out in politics, which is in this case the tale of the Roman emperor. An emperor is asked to judge a singing contest between two contestants. Upon listening to the first, they give the award to the second. That's what was going on in economics at the time. And public choice came along and said, no, you got to let the second singer sing, because the second singer may indeed be worse than the first singer. May be the case that the first singer is bad, but the second singer might even be worse. So we have to let that second singer sing. And the reason why Hayek's analysis is not fully understood here is because Hayek assumed benevolence on the part of the economic actors, that the politicians wanted to achieve the public good, but they didn't have the knowledge about how to get the public good. Whereas public choice in its first manifestation tended to assume that they knew how to do the good, but they in fact didn't want to do the good. They wanted to serve their own interests. So you can see that one is they want to do the public good, but they don't have the knowledge. The other one is that they have the knowledge, but they don't want to. They have no motivation to do the public good. And so a robust theory of political economy, a Smithian theory of political economy, dare I say, an ordoliberal political economy, would have us questioning both benevolence and omniscience, and instead have us recognize that people are people, and we're trying to find a set of rules in which very imperfect people can live better together than they ever could apart from each other. So this is my book on Hayek. I won't belabor the discussions of my self-promotion. I have a couple self-promoting here things that are just built in because that's me. I'm an economist, just remember that. But what I want to stress here is this arc of Hayek's career, because it's where he bumps into the ordoliberals in Germany. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that from Menger through Mises and Hayek and the other Austrian economists from the 1870s to the 1930s, Austrian economists were educated in law schools. That is a key educational thing to understand, because they all had to study jurisprudence, and legal philosophy is part of their education. It's a background of what's going on. And so to them, institutions were never treated as fixed and given. Institutions were never treated as something that could be forgotten. Institutions were always part of the idea. And you can see this even in Menger's Principles of Economics. And so in Hayek's early work on economics as a coordination problem, institutions are in the background, but they're never out of the picture. When you get to the Abuse of Reason project, this is where what he's trying to say is he's trying to whittle down the claims of the scientistic mentality, part of which was to treat institutions as something that they could construct out of ex nihilo. And he's trying to explain that that doesn't work. And so that leads him to this issue having to do with the road to serfdom and the counter-revolution. And then that finally leads him to then engage in a restatement of what are the liberal principles of justice. And that brings him back to the Smithian project. The last part of his career relates to what Alex started with in talking about the Acton Institute, which is the philosophical anthropology that and the study of man that underlies Hayek's theories. We won't have a chance to talk about that, but it's in these two periods here that you see his ordoliberalism come out and the recognition of that. So what's the relationship between Hayek and Buchanan? The easiest way to understand this is that Buchanan took Hamilton's challenge in Federalist number 1 really, really seriously. What Hamilton argues in Federalist 1 is that the institutions or the constitutions under which we'll operate are either going to be a consequence of accident and force or reflection and choice. And so Buchanan always wanted them to be of reflection and choice. And he agitated against Hayek's acquiescence to the evolutionary forces that generated the English common law. And so in this sense, Buchanan is a constitutionalist, but he's not a constructivist. But it sounds like he's a constructivist because he's unwilling to say, let the common law evolve, and then, we'll go from there. He wants to try to find those rules. And as he says here, his task is the derivation of the institutional order itself, the set of elementary behavioral hypotheses with which he commences. It's this endogeneity of the institutional order itself that bumps him into the ordoliberal camp as well, and why it is that he was understood in that tradition in the 70s and 80s, when he went to Europe. So I want you to read this because, again, it relates to what Alex was talking about, and as well as I anticipate aspects of what Sam might talk about here, is that it's the political economist it has technical economic principles. Those things developed in Hayek's first career as economics as a coordination problem. But then what we do is we subject them to their operation in alternative institutional frameworks, alternative property rights arrangements, we might say. And some of those property rights arrangements are promoting for peaceful cooperation and productive specialization, and others hinder that. But as Buchanan says, the political economist has to go further and try to bring out these philosophical issues that are at the core, these moral issues, our philosophical anthropology. What kind of, who's the individual that we're studying, but also what are the rules, the moral rules by which we interact with each other. And so, again, I'm very mindful of my time. I want to finish in the next 5 minutes. So going back to what I said earlier about the traditions in economics at the time, the reason why economics in the 1930s had to push institutions out was because economics was being transformed from a branch of moral philosophy into a technical science of social engineering. We were moving from social understanding and social criticism to social engineering. All right. People like Hayek and Buchanan and the ordoliberals are in fact challenging that ability of economists to do that. It's contrary to utilitarian calculus. It's a rejection of social engineering, and it's a critique of the elitist position. Why is it contrary to the utilitarian calculus? That is the aggregation of the individual preferences into a social preference for society as a whole, is because there's no easy way to aggregate those preferences to get us upon a single scale of values. Assuming that we had a single scale of values, what economics became was in fact a tool to maximize that social welfare function. But if there's no social welfare function to maximize, there's no engineering that can be done. So what Buchanan argues is that the economists must cease to offer advice as if to a benevolent despot. So we're neither omniscient nor benevolent. And then finally, economists thought of themselves as these trained experts that were part of the elite. And so whenever there was a conflict in social values, their values should trump all other values. And Frank Knight and Buchanan and other people, what they wanted to do was challenge the economists as not having that privileged position in the public discourse. And so instead, what economists who want to tinker with the social order must do is submit their reform efforts as hypotheses in the democratic process of collective decision-making, rather than presuming that they have the ability to stand outside of the system and operate from within. So this is, I sent my slides in, and anyone who's interested can look at them, but I'm trying to connect it to classical puzzles in political theory and how Buchanan addresses those issues and whatnot in developing his position. And then these are his books and his efforts at trying to do it. As I said earlier, think about Hayek and Buchanan. This was their research program, not something they wrote for popular audiences. This is what occupied their professional attention, not what they wrote as, you know, to have outreach. They were seriously engaged in this. And that's also true of people like Walter Eucken and who had to think about economic systems in a very serious way because of his experience in Nazi Germany and everything like that. So then this is another book of mine which tries to blend the ideas of Hayek and Buchanan and the Ostroms together. And I was going to go over a thing with Eleanor Ostrom. And I recommend that, but I want to give the time to Sam here by 5:30. So what I'm going to argue here is that good governance in these welfare properties, the kind of thing that the order within the ordoliberal, is a question of how do we sort from the desirable orders to the feasible orders to the viable orders, and the role that economics plays in that by being able to provide the tool for sorting, to move from what we might envision as a desirable. Just because we ought to do something doesn't mean we can do something, when we recognize that we're dealing with human beings that have to actually be coordinated with each other and to be able to cooperate. And so as a result, we're going to need to have some mechanism that provides the incentives and the information that is required And that moves us from the desirable to the feasible to the viable. So when we think about the ordoliberal order, we want an order that's a workable order, And then the scale, scope, and sustainability. What is the appropriate role for government in this? And then what is the responsiveness to citizens' demands? And this is the research program that is being developed. So let me just summarize this, and then that will be my last slide. So the first thing that is the common ground between the economists that I've been talking about and the economists that Sam has so wonderfully written about in his own book on Robke and other works on ordoliberals is the essential framework. There's a formal and informal set of institutions and their enforcement through formal and informal governance that must be analyzed in order for us to make progress. Okay. The other idea here that I want to stress is that economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. And that pushes us back to the idea of ideas and institutions. So we have to put the soul back into political economy, even after we reject the romance from public choice, because morality matters. And morality matters in a major way because it raises or lowers the transaction costs of enforcing the essential framework. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Sam. And I apologize for the little bit of, scattered nature of my presentation, but I want to make sure that Sam has his time to talk as well. So thank you, Sam.
Well, thank you so much, Pete. What a great lesson. Questions will be at the end. I prefer them if you put them in the chat, but perhaps Matthias can help me if you put them in the Q&A section. But introducing Sam is also like introducing Pete. As you have seen by their book production, we could have spent the entire evening going through the amazing books that both of these speakers have written. Sam came to Acton via Australia and Oxford, where he earned his PhD. He's a prolific author. Each human being is unique and unrepeatable. Sam, I think, is more unique and unrepeatable than others, but those of you who are from Argentina know Gabriel Zanotti, and how orderly he speaks and he presents his views. I almost regard Sam like a mixture of Kirchner, Zanotti, and Robke, but he's his own. I know we all admire Israel Kirchner, who also pays attention to his religious faith, which his Jewish faith, a wonderful human being. But Sam, for me, it's such a privilege to be able to work with him, learn daily through his writings and through his actions. So Sam, I don't know what part of the world you are in. I know you were recently in Rome lecturing. You might be on your way to Liechtenstein. But again, thank you for being with us. And we are eager to hear your comments and presentation. Sam Gregg from the Acton Institute, our boss of everything that has to do with research at the organization.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. It's great to be with you, and thank you for the UCEMA people for having me. It's a great honor to follow Pete Boettke. He is really the doyen, I often say, of Austrian economics, and all those books that he put up, including his own, I've read them all. And I'd highly recommend them to all the listeners today. I don't know if some of them have been translated into Spanish yet, but they should be. So what I'd like to do today is to really complement some of the things that Pete has already said about the ordoliberals by filling out, I suppose, what you might call some of the historical background, which parts of which Pete has already alluded to. And then I'm going to look at two particular ordoliberal thinkers. I'm going to look at, first of all, Walter Eucken, who Pete just mentioned, and I'm also going to look at Wilhelm Robke. And you'll see there are similarities and differences between these thinkers. And you'll see also that they do show that when we talk about liberalism, classical liberalism, it's always a mistake to assume this is just one school of classical liberalism. The ordoliberals, I think, are very much a group of their own with some very distinctive emphases and interests and also some very particular historical background factors that shaped a great deal of their thought. So I suppose the first thing to say about, let's call it European autoliberalism, or more specifically German autoliberalism, is that it's not especially well known in, let's call it the Anglo-Saxon world. That's partly because most of their key writings are in German or French, for that matter, and not all of them have been translated into English. A lot of Robke's work has, but Walter Euckens has not, which I think is a great shame, because he is really, I think, one of the most systematic autoliberal thinkers that lived in the 20th century. And when we talk about autoliberals in the school that I'm referring to, I'm talking about obviously Eucken and Robke, but I'm also talking about people like Alexander Rustov, Franz Bohm, who was a close colleague of Eucken at Freiburg. I'm talking about Jacques Rueff, who was the great French monetary theorist, who very much in the 1950s identified himself and his work as very much in the line of autoliberalism. But there are also lesser known thinkers like the Protestant lawyer and economist Constantin von Dietz, and the French liberal economist and Catholic social thinker Daniel Villet. So these are thinkers who are, on one level, they are in some respects influenced by Austrian economics. That was particularly true in the 1930s, when they shared the Austrian economists' rejection of the historical school. But they're also a little different from a good number of Austrian economists, as well as what you might call Chicago School libertarian thinkers. So if I was going to say there were some particular features of 20th century European autoliberalism, and Peter sort of already alluded to this, it's distinguished by an emphasis, really an insistence, on treating the law, the state, the economy, and society as interdependent orders. This phrase, interdependent, comes up all the time in their writings. And for the autoliberals, their focus was on how these interdependencies either promoted or undermined freedom. And that's where they thought the real action was to be found intellectually. Now, much of this focus on interdependencies, it reflects the autoliberals' background in social terms in what you might call turn of the century, fin de siècle, as they say, European upper middle class, which attached enormous value to all-round academic excellence. So as a matter of course, these individuals spoke and read several modern and classical languages, and it's extraordinary the sheer breadth and depth of their knowledge of multiple fields. And this has a great deal to do with the fact, with something that Pete mentioned, which is that in the German-speaking world, and to a certain extent in the French-speaking world as well, economics as a social science was generally studied in law faculties. So this meant that autoliberal thinkers, economists, were exposed to disciplines like philosophy, jurisprudence, history, political science, and even in some cases, canon law of all things. I remember reading once, I think it's in Guido Hausmann's biography of Ludwig von Mises, that Ludwig von Mises, who was very much a secular Jew, had to study canon law, the law of the Catholic Church, when he was studying for his in Vienna in the 19th century. Now, it's also interesting, this prolonged acquaintance with law, I think, helps to account for the autoliberal focus upon the idea of order, this idea of order as they researched economic issues. Now, on one level, I think it's important to keep in mind, and I think this is reflected in some of the things that Pete said about James Buchanan. Autoliberals tended to be somewhat skeptical. European autoliberals, the German autoliberals, tend to be a little skeptical of what you might call spontaneous order theories. They were somewhat skeptical of what you might call holus bolus commitments to laissez-faire. Why was this the case? Because they believed that market economies needed to be protected, not just from those people who were peddling socialist and corporatist ideas, but they thought that markets also need to be protected from businesses and business leaders who wanted to shield themselves from market competition by acquiring preferential government treatment at the expense of consumers and taxpayers. But it wasn't just a question of what they thought were the need to address through institutions, particularly legal institutions, ongoing threats to markets. There's no question that the minds of European auto-liberals were deeply affected by the political and economic crisis that engulfed Europe following the First World War and helped to bring fascist, National Socialist, and Communist parties to power. So one key idea that you find expressed in all these auto-liberal thinkers is that they talk about the need for a strong but limited state. And they thought a strong but limited state was necessary to establish and defend constitutional and legal institutions that upheld a competitive market against all its opponents, especially perhaps crony capitalists. They wanted the strong and limited state to protect the political arrangements of freedom from demagogues and mass movements. It's also the case that they drew upon a long-standing continental European tradition of public law that emphasized the state playing a type of disinterested role that tempered everyday political pressures. At the same time, they were also convinced that the very best institutions were not enough to resist predatory behavior by socialists, by corporatists, and by crony business leaders if these structures were not animated by something Pete also referred to, moral principles that put certain things beyond majority vote and certain things beyond the tyrannical demands of whatever happens to be the most immediate political concern on the political agenda. So they spent a great deal of time trying to persuade their audiences of this imperative, this need for this strong moral context, if they're going to, when they're talking about how they want to see an economic order develop. So in this regard, they turn to schools of thought like Roman law. People like Eucken were particularly interested in Kantian philosophy. People like Robke were interested in natural law theory as sources for normative foundations for freedom. It's interesting here, they referred a great deal to writers like Goethe. They talked a great deal about Lord Acton and Alexis de Tocqueville. These were very common reference pointers for them. But there are also differences within these schools. So you had people like Alexander Roustov and the French philosopher Louis Rouget, who focused very much on Enlightenment, humanist, and classical sources of morality. But what's also interesting here is that it was really religion that featured most prominently in these European auto-liberal reflections upon the type of moral order that's needed for a free economy. Most of these auto-liberals were strongly religious. One of them, Konstantin von Deutz, even served as president of the Evangelical Church in Germany from 1955 until 1961. And they were adamant about the need to associate the market with what you might call broadly Christian values, often to the point, I think, of irritating some more secular-minded liberals. Now, on one level, I think this was a type of strategic matter, because they were sufficiently aware, the auto-liberals were sufficiently aware to know that they were generals without armies, right? So they knew that if their economic principles were going to be translated into policy, they required acceptance by the only popular alternative to the political left in post-war Western Europe. And that essentially meant Christian democratic parties. But at the same time, they also thought, these auto-liberals also thought, that the liberal case for the free economy and the free society needed to be buttressed by these extra economic normative sources. And in their private letters, if you read the private letters between Walter Eucken and Wilhelm Robke, they wrote extensively about this topic. And so they spent a great deal of time trying to connect their economic and legal principles to particular Protestant and Catholic traditions of thought. So someone like Jacques Rueff, who's one of the outstanding monetary theorists of the 20th century, and who described himself as an ordo-liberal. He was a Catholic convert, and he referred extensively to people like Thomas Aquinas when he was outlining some of the moral supports required by what he called the institutional market. Now, this is where the idea of ordo comes into play. So for people like Aquinas, for other Catholic scholastics, but also early modern Protestant theologians like Philip Melanchthon, ordo was a way of describing what they called pre-given fundamental realities which they believed had been created by God, which human reason can know and then bring into being through the exercise of wisdom. So there's ordo means there's a pre-existing order that human minds can recognize, but they don't create themselves. This ordo idea also underlined something I mentioned before, the interdependence of things. So while politics, economics, and the law were distinct orders in which different activities occurred, none of these orders were self-sufficient. So that meant that those who studied, for example, monetary policy could and should think about how this relates to law and vice versa. So they embraced this idea of ordo for basically, I think, 5 reasons. One, they believed it was true. It's pretty important. Second, they knew that this idea of ordo was taken very seriously in those Lutheran and Reformed Christian circles around which German Christian democracy's Protestant wing tended to gravitate. Third, the idea of ordo, they knew it resonated with Catholics, and this opened up a bridge to a reliable anti-communist constituency that had considerable weight in post-war Europe. So it's no coincidence that devout Protestants like Eucken and Franz Boehm gave the name ordo to the very influential journal that they founded in 1948. Fourth, ordo reminded people of the need to think in orders when you're designing something like fiscal policy so as to avoid falling into the error of what they called economism. And lastly, the word ordo conveyed notions of moral stability, grounded in universal truths to a Europe that at the time was in a great deal of disarray. So let me say a couple of things about some of the achievements of ordo liberals before closing up with some remarks about Eucken and Robke. One thing to keep in mind about ordo liberals, the European ordo liberals, is that I think that of all the different schools of liberal thought in Europe, they by far have had the most impact upon public policy. Partly because they were well positioned at particular points in time. So for example, they were well positioned in 1948 when it was very clear that the collectivist fetters in which the German economy, the West German economy was still locked, had to be loosened up, but they needed an intellectual framework through which to do this. And so Ludwig Erhard, who of course is often regarded as the great liberalizer of the West German economy in 1948, his greatest intellectual supporters and backers, and who really gave him the framework for what to do, were on the one hand Walter Eucken, and the second person was, of course, Wilhelm Robke. The ordo liberals were very conscious about the importance of getting closer to politicians and realizing that they needed to work with journalists, with civil servants, central bankers, and church leaders who wielded a lot of political influence in post-war Europe. So many of them served as formal and informal advisors to governments in West Germany, Austria, France, Belgium, Italy, and the Netherlands. Some of them held high office. Luigi Unadi, for example, he served as governor of the Bank of Italy. He was Minister of Finance. He was Deputy Prime Minister and eventually became President of Italy. Franz Boehm served time in the German Parliament. Jacques Rueff became a judge on the European Court of Justice. They also spent a great deal of time building networks of scholars who would follow them both in the academy, but also in finance ministries and central banks. So I think if you want to understand why the Bundesbank, the German Bundesbank, is sort of the last stronghold of what you might call hard money policies in Germany, it owes a great deal to this ordo-liberal influence. So let me say a couple of things now about Eucken and Robke before closing. So Walter Eucken, I think, as I mentioned before, is one of these scholars that we in the English-speaking world need to know more about, and much more of his work needs to be translated into English if that's going to happen. But he was very much in the 1920s trying to work out how do you establish conditions of economic order in the conditions of Weimar Germany. So Weimar Germany is a country in which is heavily radicalized between the left and the right. It's been devastated by hyperinflation in the early 1920s. And they're trying to work out how do you preserve a liberal order in these conditions where the radical left and the radical right are constantly trying to undo what we would call a free society. And in the case of Eucken, he basically came up with a type of framework of principles that he thought needed to be imbibed by an economy and a society more generally if it was going to remain free and able to resist these pressures from the right and the left, and also from what you might call mass movements from below. So they talked about things. He talked about, for example, fundamental principles. He identified 7 constitutional principles, and he identified 4 regulative principles. So he said, for example, the most fundamental principle that's needed for an economy, the fundamental principle of order, is a free price system, He said, this is fundamental if you're going to have a free economy. He also said that this turned into the expression of constitutional principles, such as a commitment to stable money, a commitment to open markets and free trade, protection of private property, freedom to contract, liability for your commitments and choices, and lastly, the fact that all these orders were related to each other. He also tried to think about what sort of principles should regulate government interventions into the economy. And this was important for them because they were very aware that much of the German economy had been effectively cartelized from the late 1890s onwards, and they were very worried about the concentration of power that this produced. And they were constantly trying to think of ways to diminish the impact of cartelization on the German economy without falling into the trap of giving the state the power whereby it would use anti-cartel laws to essentially protect its friends and those businesses that were close to government. So what's interesting about Eucken is that while in his private correspondence, he wrote a great deal about the social, the moral, and what he believed to be the religious preconditions for a free society. He didn't write so much about those particular areas in his books. He did that privately. He was much more focused upon the legal and constitutional dimension of this ordo-liberal way of thinking about economic life. And that, I think, owed a great deal to the influence of his close colleague, Franz Boehm, who was not an economist, but was a professor of law, and who himself had been struggling with these issues of how you preserve a free society, a free economy, using constitutions and law as a way of doing that to protect it from radicals on the left and the right, who shared in common a disinterest in economic freedom and hostility to liberty in general. So when we turn to Wilhelm Robke, who's probably the most well-known ordo-liberal, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, and that's partly because he was a tremendous self-publicist, but he was also extensively published in the English-speaking world. Now, he wrote a great deal in the 1930s about things like business cycle theory, questions of monetary order, but really from the mid-1930s onwards, he's considering and thinking about the preconditions, the non-economic conditions that are necessary for a free economy. And he spent much time talking about some of the legal dimension that I mentioned before with regard to Walter Eucken. He articulates many of the same principles about constitutional principles, regulative principles, and fundamental principles. You see this in his one of his famous books, The Social Crisis of Our Time, which came out in 1942, and many of the other works that he wrote in this period as well. But he's focused a great deal, as well as on the legal side, he also spoke about the sociological dimension of all this, the sociological dimension of all this. And so he was very interested in exploring the historical background of the emergence of institutions. He was very focused on how political philosophies and different forms of theology shaped the social context in which markets have emerged. He was very interested in exploring the historical roots of particular institutions. And so if you read books like The Social Crisis of Our Time or International Economic Order, I would say maybe half of these books are about economics. The other half are about what we would call sociological and cultural questions. So this is not to say, let me say this by concluding, this is not to say that there aren't difficulties with aspects of their thought. So for example, while they were very interested in having a strong and limited state that would protect the market, they weren't always particularly good at identifying where are the precise lines that you must not cross when it comes to using the state or using legal institutions to protect the free market and the liberal society. In many cases, it came down to things like in some cases they would say, well, really, we need good men and women who will simply instinctively know where these limits are. Well, that's fine. Okay, I'm all in favor of that. But so that what they were doing here was saying in some respects that while principles matter, constitutions matter, rules matter, it also matters who the people in power are. And this is, I suspect, why you find in some of their writings, there's a little bit of suspicion of democracy. They're suspicious of mass movements, but they're also suspicious of the different types of people that are spawned by mass movements. And this is partly because of the Nazi experience. It was also a question of the disorder in which much of Western Europe found itself in. And they were very concerned to make sure that the right type of people were in charge. So to that extent, they were very conscious of making sure that the right type of people were placed in the right type of position so that the rules that the ordo-liberals were so interested in making sure were in place were consistently enforced and with integrity. But of course, there's no way of guaranteeing that you're going to get the right people in power at particular points in time. So that's one weakness. Another weakness, of course, is that they do come from these, what you might call upper middle class, turn of the century backgrounds. And that's their working assumption of the world. But we live in a different world now where those types of assumptions cannot be assumed. We live in a world in which there's what you might call less respect for rules. We're also living in a world in which the emphasis upon the type of moral and cultural context that they were so insistent upon is considerably weaker in our time, I would suggest, than in theirs. But I do think they're still worth studying. They're still worth studying because for many of the reasons that Pete mentioned, because they were so focused upon the importance of institutions when a lot of the rest of the economics profession was basically ignoring institutions. I liked Pete's phrase, was it institutional skepticism? I can't remember what it was, but the ordo-liberals really understood the importance of institutions long before, I think, a lot of other classical liberals working in slightly different traditions did. And remember, by institutions, they don't just necessarily mean the rules. The rules are part of it, but there's also these deeper, what you might call moral and cultural roots that they thought needed to be protected if the institutions were to flourish and if the institutions were to protect the free economy and the free society more generally. So I'll stop there because I'm sure there are questions.
Thank you so much, Sam. What wonderful lessons of history of economic thought, so relevant for today's debate. Pete, would you like to make a few comments now, or we go straight to the question? We have several good ones.
We have several good ones, so I would like to get a stab at Diego's question, if possible. and it relates to
Okay,
stuff Sam was just talking about.
You want to read it or I read it?
Yeah, I can read it. It's the question about the relationship between the Austrian school and the Ordoliberals with respect to government intervention. And I would like to address that issue, I think, if I can. First, I want to say, Sam, thank you for that talk. I thought the 5 conditions that you gave in the context were extremely important to understanding why it is the points of emphasis were made, and points of where they find bridges to build their ideas in a post-Nazi world. I mean, this is important to remember, is that these ideas are evolving. They go before they were developed before Hitler, but we're talking about rebuilding a society after it had been at the brink of devastation. And it's one of the reasons why Mont Pelerin, it was such an important thing for Hayek to have Eucken at the first Mont Pelerin, because he was trying to integrate the German intellectuals back into the international community of liberals, and show that kind of faith in that. But I want to address, so I think, and Sam can correct me on this, I think that their concern were 1, the conditions of competition, 2, power and privileges, and 3, money and secondary depressions. So depending on the different ideas, and each of those, they felt that a strong but minimal state played a vital role in doing that. And so in talking about the Austrians and the Otto school, the first thing that should be recognized is that the way people think about the Austrian school today is a lot more influenced by Murray Rothbard than it is by Hayek and Mises. So Hayek and Mises were just, on the face of it, much closer to Ordoliberals than Rothbard, who's a different beast altogether. And so if you forget the Austro-libertarianism, which culturally is what kept the Austrian school alive in America 1970 to today or whatever, and instead just go back to the intellectual tradition of Menger and Böhm-Bawerk and Mises and Hayek and what they stood for, in many ways, what they stand for is very similar. And I think we forget this. So for example, in Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, addressing the conditions of competition and why we must move, Sam, it was institutionally antiseptic, and why we have to move back to the issues. He says, this is on page 87, I won't read the full quote, but he says, it is regrettable, although not difficult to explain, that in the past, much less attention has been given to the positive requirements of a successful working of a competitive system than to those negative points, that is, the problems of government intervention. He says the systematic study of the form of legal institutions which will make the competitive system work effectively have been sadly neglected, and he's going to make them be in the forefront. So, and Hayek is against, throughout the book, The Road to Serfdom, what he called the wooden conception of laissez-faire, that things would just take care of themselves. I'll come to Mises at the very end of this. If you look at Menger, Menger was asked, there's a wonderful essay where Menger is asked to reflect on the 100th anniversary of Adam Smith's death. And he talks about the importance of Adam Smith's social politique. So, the German social politique of the German historical school, and they dismissed the classicals because they said they didn't have a social politique. And what Menger says in his survey of Smith's thought, he says, in every single instance where there is a conflict between the power and those with power and privilege and those that do not have the power and do not have the privilege, Smith sides on the side of the powerless and the lack of privilege. And so, they right. And so that's Menger right there. And then finally, on secondary depressions and the Great Depression, of course, Hayek recognized the role of secondary depressions. Robke oftentimes criticized the Austrians. He was an advocate of Austrian business cycle theory, but he criticized them for not recognizing these secondary depressions, as did Habeler and some others. But the Austrians did recognize the secondary depressions. And in a quip, one of Mises's most entertaining quips is he says, trying to correct for inflation by bouts of deflation is like I run over a man with my car and then I put it in reverse to try to back it up. I still have flattened the man in both cases, right? And so we have to understand that the Austrian view is a little bit more nuanced than the Austro-libertarian view puts forth. Now, let me defend the Austro-libertarian view for a second, is that, as Sam pointed out, not only has the cultural context shifted between then and now, but we've also learned a lot about our efforts to use the law to try to promote competition, to try to eradicate power and privileges through various different policies, and to, in fact, manage the money supply through central bank management. And I think that we should take seriously Hayek's line when he stands up at his Nobel Prize and says to fellow economists, hey, you fellow economists, you've made a mess of things, because we have, in fact, not done very well in antitrust policy, promoting competition, in central banks promoting monetary stability, or in eradicating power and privileges by trying to, give level playing field to various people who have been dispossessed. And so in each of these cases, we start thinking, well, maybe this powerful minimal state too easily morphs into a powerful behemoth of a state. And so therefore our efforts to tie the ruler's hands are not as effective at the constitutional level as we would hope. So then we try to find other mechanisms that are more decentralized and more competitive in nature that check, because the rules don't do enough. Now, and then this is the last thing I said, Sam already anticipated what the response would be, is because the Ordoliberals already recognize, and Mises himself already recognizes this, that unless you have the legitimating ideology or moral agreement, you are not going to be able to sustain the liberal order. So the ideas have to be there. And if those ideas aren't there, then it's all going to go for naught. And so I'm going to just tell you a kind of a quick little story about Milton Friedman. So Milton Friedman famously went to China in 1979, and he was asked, what should he do? And he said, privatize, privatize, privatize. Right? You can look this up. This is his privatize, privatize, privatize. In 2006, before he passed away, he was asked a question, would you ever change Friedman's dictum of privatize, privatize, privatize? And he said, yes, I have one caveat: privatize, 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 provided there's a rule of law. Okay, so in that very statement, he is making the essential ordoliberal move. You can't privatize, privatize, privatize without the rule of law. Sam is stressing another aspect. You don't get a rule of law unless you have a moral heritage of which you understand that. And so this is what, Vernon Smith has stressed when he talks about the sentiments coming out of Smith and that background. We have to have that, or what he calls Hume's three principles are the great thou nots, shall nots, not thou nots, shall nots of human history, right? And so we have to understand, that there was a long line of thinking that is not only in the Thomist tradition, but also in the Scottish Enlightenment and others that recognize this moral fiber that's necessary to have the rules, which is necessary to have the operation of the market economy. And what happens to a society when we're in a post-truth world, it's all up for grabs in a lot of ways. And so that's the world that we find ourselves in today. And how do we patch that back? We can't just assume that we have the background conditions. We have to actually have those build up. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you. That's somewhat a long-winded answer, but I think it's a nuanced interaction.
No, I think that everything you said is true, especially the contextual factors that make the world of the ordoliberals so different from us today. The post-truth thing is really important because the ordoliberals really believed there was truth, right? Not just economic truth, but metaphysical truth, philosophical truth, religious truth. they spent a great deal of time exploring and talking among these things among themselves. You see this, I think, this coming out at the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting. If you look at the program for the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting, about half of it's on economics, but the rest of it is on things like the future of Germany, the relationship between liberalism and Christianity, the rule of law, what the meaning of competitive order is. So you see them focusing upon these issues because they think these are just as important as getting the economics right. One thing I will stress in this regard is that they really, it was something Pete just mentioned, they really looked in many respects to the tradition of Scottish Enlightenment political economy, because as we all know, Scottish Enlightenment thinkers writing about political economy, by that they meant what the new social science, what we would call economics, but also the way that that related to all the other fields of knowledge that were starting to become much more developed at this point in time. So in terms of the role of the state, as I mentioned in my remarks, Ordoliberals, they belong to this tradition that viewed the state as having a role in defending good things from populist movements, from demagogues on the left and the right, and what they would call the mob, basically. This is the way that they thought about the world. But what we have learned, and I think some of the Ordoliberals later in life started to see this, that drawing the line about where you say the state has to stop trying to do things is much more difficult. It's also the case that we've learned a lot. So for example, Robke in the 1930s and 1940s really thought that antitrust policy had a legitimate role to play in dealing with, for example, the problem of the cartelization of much of the German economy. But by the late 1950s, early 1960s, he had rejected this view. And the reason he rejected this view was he realized that antitrust action could very easily become a political weapon used by whoever is in power or whoever controls the antitrust agency. And Milton Friedman, by the way, underwent a similar type of realization. So being someone who was somewhat favorable of antitrust legislation in the 1940s, by the end of his career has completely rejected it. So you do see them thinking through some of these questions and learning from experience. As for the question about central banks, which I see is on the list, the Ordoliberals, they were not hung up on whether you should have a gold standard or whether you have a central bank that's tied to certain rules. Robke tended to favor a gold standard. Rueff favored a gold standard, but what they were more concerned about was monetary order. That was what mattered. They weren't as concerned about how you got there, but they wanted to make sure that how you got there was an effective way of actually achieving that objective. So, so in that regard, you can see them thinking very clearly about fundamental conditions of order. And this is why so many of them wrote a great deal about monetary policy, because they did take the view that the free price system is fundamental, but the free price system itself depends upon a sound monetary order. So that's a very good example of how they thought in orders about any number of questions.
There are two questions, but I think you sort of answered one. It's about what is the common ground between the Ordoliberalism and the Austrians. And then the other one by Federico Sosavaggi asked that. Thank you, Federico, for joining us. And then Claudio Lutzki asked about any lessons for today from how Eucken recommended, tackling the Weimar Republic.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, classical liberals were a distinct minority in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. And what's interesting about Eucken is that some of his most productive thinking in this regard actually happened in the context of living in the dictatorship. So living in the dictatorship of Nazi Germany at the University of Freiburg. Eucken spent a great deal of time basically engaging what you might call beneath the radar resistance. By that I mean he spent a great deal of time building up circles, what were called Freiburger circles, of people who were like-minded individuals who were trying to think about what type of order is going to emerge after what they believed would be the inevitable crack up of the Nazi regime. So they turned a great deal to questions of constitutional order. If you read the things that he was writing in the late 1930s, remember, he's subject to censorship, he's subject to harassment. It doesn't help him that his wife is Jewish. He has to be very careful about all sorts of things. But if you read, for example, the principles, I think it's of the Ordo program that was produced by himself and Franz Bohm in 1938, you find it all spelled out there. And it's very much a type of constitutional framework, heavily influenced by Kantian thought, as well as certain aspects of Thomistic thought. Now, to what extent does this apply today? Well, it's obviously a way of thinking about how you build up resistance to populist movements on the left and the right who are trying to dismantle free societies and free economies and who want lots of government intervention. But also, I think it's important to remember that they also thought that the rules are really important, but unless we win the moral and cultural arguments, no amount of good rules and good constitutions are going to stop the march of populists on the left or on the right as part of their effort to try and deconstruct a free society. So rules matter, constitutions matter, the right people being in the right positions also matters, but you must have this broad common cultural consensus shared by enough of the population if you're going to defend a free society. If you lose that, then everything else will be fine for a while, but at some point it will start to crumble. So that's the lesson I think they have for us today. The rules are important, constitutions are important, but you need this moral cultural context. And if it's not there, freedom becomes much harder to defend.
Hey, Alex,
Before we go,
I just wanted to take a stab at Cecilia's question, if there's time. She's asking
only, yeah, I was going to move towards that. It's a difficult epistemological question, but just to answer in a simple way, the common ground, it's only in these two traditions, I think, that you look at just the title of the books, like I'm going just to pick two, von Mises, Human Action, Murray Rothbard, Man, Economy and State, Wilhelm Robke, Humane Economy, Jacques Reff, and finally the book is going to come up in English because Liberty Finds and a Contract with Jacques Reff family, The Social Order, so there is a view of economics grounded in the human person. Again, now Pete is going to answer about the epistemological, the deep scientific methodology of both schools. So Pete, you're answering the last question from Cecilia Vasquez, head of Instituto Acton in Argentina, that does wonderful work helping us promote these events. Pete.
Well, thank you. And I agree with everything that you and Sam have just said. And I think it's important to go back to Austrian methodology and go to the roots in Menger. And so the reason why Mises had to use the praxeology is because originally he wanted to use the term sociology, but the Durkheimian movement had so taken over for the Weberian movement in sociology that term wasn't meaningful to him by the time he shifts in the 30s to develop the term praxeology. But let me come back to that in a second. So I think that means something. So what did Menger call it? He called the exact method, the empirical realistic theory, and then history. And what was Eucken trying to develop, right? A theory of economic systems. And what he wanted to do was be able to compare between systems. So imagine that you're intellectually sliding between different possible worlds. And then you want to study the examination of the operation within these different possible worlds. Well, what allows you to do that is exact theory. But it's the theory that you get of the interaction of those contexts of those worlds with pure theory is empirical realistic theory. All right. And so the problem, again, is that people have, in my opinion, have misunderstood what praxeology is, because they think praxeology is just exact theory. But as I just said about the sociology aspect, if you look at Mises's economics and sociological analysis of socialism, praxeology is the study of human action in its manifold possible interactions. And the deductive logic is the development of the theory of the pure logic of choice, but that's always met up with situational analysis. And so Robke's, Euchen's book, and it's interesting, I think, what Sam said earlier, which is that if you read Euchen's Principles of Economics book that he came out with, his treatise or whatever, there's no talk like it is in Robke about morality and all that kind of stuff like that. It's much more of a technical economics book, and it's a book trying to do this comparative economic systems. But obviously, as Sam pointed out, in his personal correspondence, he's stressing, these other things that underlie that. But, and that's why I think Hayek sees a kindred soul in Euchen, right? Is that he sees this comparative institutional analysis as our salvation against the excessive aggregation of the Keynesian system and the excessive formalism of the sort of general equilibrium market socialism kind of position, the Walrasians. And so they're standing in between these two, aggregation and formalism, and they're offering a scientific economics that steers between the two of them and can assess. And so I, again, would see them as being part of a intellectual tradition of a genuine institutional economics, not the historicist and not the formalist. They stand between the two of them. And so, yeah. So anyway, I think it's a great question, and it takes a lot of digging to sort it out, but that's what makes it interesting for those of us who care about epistemology questions, Alex, which is, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Pete and Sam, for these amazing classes, really to the level of where the Hayek-Friedman Center at UCEMA wants to go. And again, I cannot thank you enough for your untiring work, to educate, the current and future generations. I have so many questions that I would like to ask. We leave it perhaps for next year, especially the Ordoliberals had a good influence in many of the moralists of the time, like Messner, Hefner, Utz, and we don't have sometimes that dialogue between the Austrian school and the Ordoliberals that we would like. We were moving towards that with Acton Institute. I just want to finish. Matthias, I don't know, do you have a flyer we can announce our next class? Because we have also superb analyst of today's economic reality in the United States, Tim Carney, who works on crony capitalism, on business lobbies at the American Enterprise Institute. Few voices are as learned and courageous as his. Do you have that, Matthias? Or is Edgardo there to close the session?
Matthias, do you have it?
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Edgardo. Yes, I've just copied it in the chat session, so everyone is invited to our next edition of the Cátedra Acton in Universidad del CEMA. You'll find the link to a further description of this seminar with Tim Carney, as Alex was commenting, and you'll also be able to find the link to be able to attend this event as well. So we'll really hope you'll join us again for this last edition of the Cátedra Acton at Universidad del CEMA. Thank you. Edgardo?
So thank you, Alex, as always, to help us to bring together Peter and Sam. Thank you both of you too for this moment. I am sure that all the people are very, very happy. And the fact is that 1 hour and a half has lasted, and we can stand here for all night long. It is night in Buenos Aires. It is almost what time is it? 8:30 in Buenos Aires, but always there is a time to say, okay, better to stand here and come back. Matthias, you are managing director of the Friedman Hayek Center. I guess you close this session. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Peter.
I want to, before I
you.
give to
Yeah, of
Matthias,
course.
you know, when Pete showed the book, Road to Serfdom, with an introduction by John Chamberlain, and then spoke about James Buchanan, I had the privilege, you know, of meeting all these great guys. And I'm sure that many of people who have spent time with Pete and Sam Gregg in the future say, I studied with Sam Gregg or with Pete Becky. I spent time with them because they are of that high level, you know, of these great giants that preceded us. So Matthias, your turn.
Thank you, Edgardo. Thank you, Alex. And of course, thank you to our amazing panelists this afternoon, Peter, Sam. It was amazing to learn more from you. And we hope all our attendants also leave this lecture with this sense of stimulation and thrill that I'm also having. So again, just thanking you all and hoping you'll join us again on the 14th for this amazing next event with the Cátedra Acton at UCEMA. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. See you and thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Something, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful.